welcome back again to our discussion of theories of interpersonal communication. This is part 2. In our last discussion, you may recall that we looked at social learning theory, social cognition, how people acquire information in interpersonal relationships, and how they use that in their schemata, in their constructs, in their constructive view of the world to make decisions. We looked at what happens when that information is discrepant and positively or negatively arouses certain things cognitively for us and so on. We also looked at Jack and Jill and took them through the stages of relational development that Mark Knapp has identified, those 5 stages, and then unfortunately Jack and Jill got a divorce before it was over with, and they moved through the 4 stages of relational dissolution. Now all that happened very quickly, so what we're going to do in this lecture is go back and look at some of the strategies, some of the things that probably were going on at the time or during the time that this couple was married. Certainly these are, of course that's a hypothetical couple, but these are the kinds of things that occur that cause relationships, as relationships are beginning to disengage, there are certain behaviors that we can engage in, certain communication choices that we have. Let's get a few of these up here. Okay, sometimes when we want out of a relationship, all we have to do is withdraw. You know, you're in a social group, you get in a conversation, you find the people boring, you excuse yourself, you move on to some other group, and that's all there is to it. Or maybe you've been working in a particular position and, you know, this office is just not quite what you expect. Many of you withdraw from classes. That's a classic example of withdrawal. For whatever reason, you decide you don't want to be in there anymore, and you go drop the course, and you literally withdraw from the course. Well, we do the same sort of thing in our interpersonal relationships. And sometimes that's all we have to do to get out of the situation. You're not married, you're not under a contract of any sort at work or in your lease agreement and so on. And so you simply withdraw and that gets you out. Other times we engage in what's called pseudo de-escalation. We know, after having that little intrapsychic voice talk to us, that we want out of this relationship. We've really had more than we can handle here. But, you know, that same voice tells you it'd be kind of rude to just walk into the boss and say, I quit. Or to go to this person that you're dating and say, you know, I've decided I'm not going to go out with you anymore. Bye. Most of us would interpret that as rude. So pseudo, you probably know, means false. De-escalation means slowing down. So this is where you frequently find couples who are dating saying things to each other like, you know, I think we need to put a little space in our relationship. I think we've been seeing too much of each other lately, and in order to be sure that we really love each other and that we've made the right choice here, perhaps we ought to date some other people for a while, you know, just to make sure that this is the right thing. So instead of going out with you 5 nights a week, I'm just going to go out with you once a week, and I'm going to see some other people too. When you know full well that this is a fake slowing down. In your mind, the end is already in sight. So it's pseudo, it's fake, de-escalation, slowing down. A false slowing down, a fake slowing down in the relationship. But that's one way that we disengage ourselves from relationships. Okay, the third I always think is an interesting one, cost escalation. Now remember, in the last lecture we said under social exchange theory that there's a cost and a reward for every relationship. By sitting here talking to you, you know, that negates all the other things that I could be out there in the world doing today. By your sitting there listening to me, that's costing you. I don't want to remind you of how much, or you may turn this off. But there's a cost and a reward. And I hope that the reward is satisfactory. But there's a cost and reward in relationships. Well, if we want out of a relationship, then we run up the cost. So maybe, you know, in your romantic relationship, it used to just be enough to see each other and hold hands and walk through the park or the zoo, or maybe have an ice cream cone, or, you know, walk by a water fountain, some little romantic, something like that. Well, maybe you reach a point that that's no longer enough. You know, if I'm going to stay in this relationship, it's time for steak dinners, or it's time for expensive gifts, or it's time for maybe more of your time. Maybe it's not a money issue, maybe it's a time issue. And you know that many couples get much more possessive of each other the more time that they spend. And it's not always possessive in the negative sense. You enjoy each other, and so you want to be together. But anyway, cost escalation is when you run the cost up with the pure intent of running the other person off. So the gifts have to be more expensive, or the food has to be more expensive, or no longer can the guy have his night out with the other guys. You know, all of your time except at work should belong to me, whatever it may be. That's what cost escalation is. Run the cost up so that it's too expensive. Maybe it's too emotionally draining. That's another one too. Maybe there's a lot of nagging or whining, griping, just ragging on the other person, and that's so stressful emotionally that the cost is too high. I just don't want to listen to it anymore. Sometimes you know people that are so needy that you don't want to be around them. A friend of mine coined the term an emotional black hole. There are some people who are emotional black holes. They just suck the energy and the life out of you. Okay? Well, those people have run the cost up to such an extent that it's no longer any fun to be around them. It's not worth your time. You can spend your time in better ways. Okay, fading away is the two-person version of withdrawal. And we need to note back up in the title that these are strategies, not stages. When we have something like NAP's 5 stages, DUC's 4 stages, when you've got stages, you have to progress through those stages, one after the other, in order. You may not spend an equal amount of time in the stages, but you have to go through all of those stages to get from 1 to 5. Okay. Strategies are simply a taxonomy. These are things that people do, but they're not done in any particular order. In many cases, you can't even do all of them. You can't have withdrawal and fading away at the same time, because withdrawal is what one person does, fading away is what both people do. And sometimes you both recognize in a situation that dating this person or taking this job was just a bad choice. You know, it doesn't fit into your schemata. It doesn't fit into your interpretation of the world and where you see yourself going and so forth. And that point of view is held by the other person as well. And so you both make a choice just to fade away in this situation. And nobody has to run the cost up. Nobody has to make that little pseudo de-escalation speech about how I really think we need some more space, etc., etc. You just both recognize that, and both people drift out of the relationship. Okay, let's look at some more strategies, because there are a lot of ways that we can get out of these things. Okay, sometimes we have a state of the relationship talk, an attributional conflict, or a negotiated farewell. We have 4 more choices, or fait accompli. There are 4 more good basic choices here. A state of the relationship talk, you know, sometimes it's the boss who calls you in and says, I think we need to talk. Sometimes it's your fiance, and it can be she or it can be he. You know, we've been engaged for 7 years now, I think, or we've been dating for 7 years now, and there's still no engagement ring. We need to talk about this. Or, I've had this engagement ring for 7 years now. We really need to talk about setting the official date. Or we need, you know, whatever it is, we need to talk about the relationship. And it probably means that the relationship is in trouble and it's about to begin dissolving, disengaging, unless something dramatic happens for the better soon. Okay, attributional conflict. This is a good one. I always enjoy getting true confessions from these on people. Attributional conflict means you pick a fight and blame it on the other person. Now, nobody we know would do anything like that, right? Okay, we do that sometimes, though, and certainly you know people who have done it. Attributional conflict. You pick a fight and blame it on the other person. Well, now, how does that little scenario go? Well, might be something like, here you go out for your usual Saturday night dinner, and he says to she, where do you want to eat? And she said, oh, I don't know, where do you want to eat? And he says, I don't know, you decide. And she says, well, it doesn't matter to me, you decide. And he says, no, you decide. And she says, no, you decide. And so, okay, he decides. And then she says, you picked that? Why did you pick that place? You know I hate that place, etc., rant, rave, have a big fit. And his response is, you told me to decide. You told me it didn't matter. Well, I told you that, but you should have known. Now, we'll come to mind reading later on as a destructive communication pattern. You should have known. You should have remembered that I hate eating there. I don't want to eat anywhere at all. Just take me home. And so here we've had a case where she knew, or he knew, put the shoe on whichever foot it belongs on. The person knew they were setting the other one up. Now, we'll come to double bind theory later on, too. Is it the frying pan or the fire, catch-22, and what the characteristics of that are, so that hopefully when you see that coming, you can head it off at the pass. But an attributional conflict says you pick a fight, you generate a conflict, and you blame it on the other person. And most of us know with the people that we're close to, that we're around a lot, that we know what the trigger words are, we know what the trigger subjects are, we know how to set each other off. And certainly people who've lived around each other for a number of years are pretty good at that. Okay, a negotiated farewell is probably the healthiest of the 8 strategies that we examine here. A negotiated farewell says we sit down and we talk this thing out. We recognize that it's going to be over, that we need to disengage. Some healthy examples of that. There are some people who, when getting a divorce, can actually sit down and talk about it. And can say, okay, you get the dogs, I get the cats, you get the boat, I get the car, you get this house, I get that house. Of course, it works better if there are lots of things of equal value to distribute. Who gets the kids? Depends on what kind of kids you have. Or if there's only one dog, who gets the dog? But the negotiated farewell says we sit down and we work these things out the best that we can to the satisfaction of both people involved. And folks that have gotten quickie divorces, even if they had a lot of assets, probably sat down and did some sort of negotiated farewell so that they had all that stuff worked out and they didn't have to go to get lawyers and go to court and have a big scene and tie all their money up there and so forth. Another example of a negotiated farewell is as tenured professors at the university reach retirement age or approach retirement time. There's some variety in that. We call it voluntary modification of employment around here. But they sit down and they work out a deal to the satisfaction of themselves and their chairman and the dean, and a provost probably has to get in that too. I'm not there yet, so I'm not sure. Okay, but you strike a deal where you'll have a reduced teaching load, a reduced salary, but it's in that case, it's not a permanent, immediate termination. It's a kind of phasing out, which gives the department some time for transition, gives the budget some time to adjust, provides some money for adjuncts. We won't go too far with that. But whether it's full-time retirement from your corporate work environment, whether it's leaving as a partner of the law firm, faculty member, divorce of a couple, whatever, The negotiated farewell is where people sit down and work it out. It's one of those places where exit interviews often become important in the workplace, to sit down and find out why the person is leaving the company and just get information about that, but we won't go too far with that. But negotiated farewell is where the parties involved sit down, talk it over, negotiate the deal, and hopefully reach a point that is to the mutual satisfaction of everyone who's involved. Okay, fait accompli, we get from the Latin. You can see the root of the word accomplish there, accompli, accomplish. Fait is the from the Latin word to make or to do. So when Captain Picard says, you know, make it so, well, fait accompli is kind of translated, it's done. Now, it is done, it is accomplished when you come into your office and the pink slip is waiting for you. Or the spouse walks into the other one and says, here, I file for divorce today. You know, it's over, it's a done deal, and it's happened rapidly and quickly and without negotiated farewell, without taking the time for any of these other strategies that we've been talking about. It's simply over and it's terminated. Okay? And all of these are ways that people get out of relationships, and that one in particular will get you out of a relationship in a hurry. Okay, we've alluded a time or two in here to compliance gaining strategies, and it's time to look at those more specifically. Before I go on with the visuals, stop and think for a minute. How do you get someone to do what you want them to do? How do you get somebody to do what you want them to do? How do you get your dad to give you the keys to the car? How do you get mom to give you money? How do you get mom to cook your favorite dessert? Or dad, so I don't want to be sexist here, you know. But how do you get that favorite dessert cooked? How does the doctor get the patient to take all of the medicine? Okay? This doesn't always have to be strictly interpersonal, family, romantic, whatever. How does the boss get the employee to do the extra work, stay overtime, go the extra mile, whatever the case may be? Well, some of the things we do is make promises. If you'll do this for me, I'll do that for you. You know, type this paper for me and I'll go out and wash your car, or whatever the case may be. There are all kinds of promises we make. Sometimes we make threats. If you don't do this, let me tell you what's going to happen. You know, and it won't be pleasant. Sometimes it's a positive or negative expertise kind of thing. You know, it may be the doctor who says to you, lose the weight, or here are the negative consequences that are going to occur. Or, you know, I'm an expert on, I'm not, but, you know, my mechanic is an expert on the automobile, and he says unless you change the oil or replace the spark plugs or whatever the case may be, there are going to be some negative consequences to all of this. Sometimes it's a matter of liking. We do things because we want people to like us. You know, and in elementary school, we weren't very subtle about that. You know, we might say things like, if you let me play with your Barbie doll, I'll be your very best friend. Or if I can play with your big dump truck, I'll be your best friend. You know, and this is a promise to like in exchange for something else. As adults, we're a little more, usually we're more subtle about it, but not always. Sometimes we use debt. Okay, you owe me. Remember when I did such and such for you? I drove clear across town, picked you up, did thus and so, or I stayed up typing this paper so you could study for your test. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we get in debt with one another over. And so, you know, I'll like you if you do what I want you to, or you owe me, and therefore if it's payback time. These are just things we do. Sometimes we use a moral appeal. You know, well, it's the right thing to do, or it's the wrong thing to do. You know, it's a sin to do that. You tell me you're going to do that? that's wrong, or right, depending on which way you're playing that one. Okay, there's some other strategies that we use. Sometimes pre-giving, we give in advance in expectation of, I think it's kind of like bribing, but it's not quite that overt. But we give in advance of expectation of good things in the future. I'll do a favor now, and then, just in the back of my mind, I'll know, well, you owe me one. It's kind of like debt, but it involves giving in advance so that you've kind of got something in your checking account. You've got stored up something on your behalf. Okay, aversive stimulation. Mama never called it that. She just said, I'm going after the paddle. Okay, but there are all kinds of aversive stimulation, whether it's your daddy's belt, your mom's paddle, going without dinner, being sent to your room, not getting your paycheck until you finish the job. There are all kinds of negative things out there that we can use on one another or have used on us in order to stimulate us. You're going to get an F, or you're going to get a 0. Look at those dates on the syllabus. Things are due at a particular time. In many cases, you're losing a letter grade a day if stuff is turned in late. See, that's aversive stimulation. Most of you don't want to hear that. It would be much more, it's not as bad in this class as it is in some of mine, how aversive the stimuli have to be in order to get those deadlines met. But see, it would be much more convenient if we just said, enroll in the course, and any time in the next year that it suits your fancy to come take a test or turn that paper in, hey, that'll be fine, Everybody's got stuff going on. Well, we have to be better organized and more on schedule than that. Sometimes we appeal to the individual's self-feeling. How are you going to feel if you do that? Okay? Sometimes they'll make you feel bad. You're going to feel awful if you do that. Or we'll say, you'll feel really good if you do that. Look at the responses of people after the flood, particularly the positive things that happened. And I doubt that many people even had to say, if you go clean out your closet and take your clothes and all your canned goods and stuff that you don't need over to one of the shelters, that's going to make you feel really good. But maybe, there were some people sitting there watching TV and watching floodwaters going, well, I probably ought to do something, but just kind of hate to get out in this stuff. And someone else in the room may have said, well, if you don't do something, you're going to feel really bad about that later on. Or phrase it the other way, if you get up and do it, even though it's inconvenient and it's hot and muggy and yak, these things are wrong, you'll feel really good about that. And so we do that a lot with each other. We also throw people into a positive or a negative role. Alter casting is putting them into a role different from what they typically engage in. And, a really nice person would do this sort of thing. Only a real ogre or a real bum or a real jerk would do that sort of thing. And I don't think you're that kind of a person. So we cast people into roles. You're my guardian angel if you do this. You're just a saint, and that's alter casting. You little devil, you'd better stop that. Positive or negative alter casting. Altruism, appealing to the goodness of the person, their willingness to be generous. Kind of like related to the others is positive and negative self-esteem. That it's a play on the same thing. It says that you'll feel good or you'll feel bad about this is going to make you feel good, this will make you feel bad. Okay. Power is an important factor in what kind of strategy is used. And so some of these strategies that we've just looked at, I've regrouped here according to how likely they are to be used based on the kind of power that the person with power, the dominant person, has over the submissive or less powerful, sometimes powerless person. Okay? There's the power to manipulate another person's expectations and consequences. And these are the people who can use promises or threats or warnings. Usually bosses and parents fall logically into this category. Okay? There's some people who don't have any control over you. You know, I don't have much control over you, my students, and if they're viewers of this lecture that aren't even enrolled in my class, maybe you're just watching it as a friend who is enrolled does. You know, I have no power over you. I can't make you learn this stuff. Hopefully I can make it interesting enough that you'll see the relevance and you'll remember it, which takes us back to central and peripheral routing under our persuasion theories. But bosses, parents, teachers can say, if you don't learn this, you're going to get an F. If you don't do this, or you'll get a C, whatever you've earned. You know, parents can say, you don't mow the grass, you're not getting your allowance. You don't do your laundry, you're not getting any supper. And so that's a different kind of power than a couple of other types that we're going to see here. In some cases, it's a matter of identification. We identify with the person because they have a powerful relational position to us. And when that's the case, the things like liking and flattery work much better. Emotional appeals, positive, negative esteem, because we want these people to like us. We want them to think well of us. And so, you know, whether it's the boss, you want to convince the boss you're a really hard worker, you're always there bright and early, you're willing to stay late, you'll shave some time on your lunch hour in order to get a little extra done. You may do a special favor, maybe you're the one that does the coffee pot. I don't know, you know, depends on what it is in any given context. But because we identify with the person and want them to like us, we are willing to do things that we wouldn't do for somebody else. We just say, you know, because you have to draw a line somewhere. You can't do everything that everybody, at least most of us can't, do everything that everybody wants us to do in a particular situation. So it's those people that we like and identify with that we're more responsive toward those. And when they make emotional appeals or flatter us and so forth, we're affected by those more. Okay. A third category involves the people who have the ability to define our values, to define what's important to us. And so we see things like debt, guilt, moral appeals, and those people may be individuals like ministers, significant others. And so if we look at this third category, we'll see that up there we have the ability to define values or obligations, and those people who have that power will be using things like debt, guilt, moral appeals, and so forth, and they are the significant others in our lives. They are the ones that we listen to if they're addressing values, moral issues. There's some people who could tell you that's a sin, you shouldn't do it. You go, yeah, right, whatever. Okay, and somebody else tells you that, and you might be impressed by it. So whoever those significant others are in your life. Okay, attribution theory is one of those theories that we've alluded to in the course of the semester. I used it back when we were originally talking about theories because it's a short one, but it's an important one. And I'd say it has the status of laws. Some of these little principles we're going to read here just really hold true over a wide domain. People perceive behavior as being caused. You know, and that's true of virtually all people. You perceive behavior as being caused. If you're falling asleep, there's a reason for it. If you're late, I assume there's a reason for it, whether it's an inherent flaw in your personality or that you had a flat tire. And so what we'll do is recognize that the cause can either be in the perceiver or in the environment. If I think you're just a basically lazy, irresponsible person, then see, I put the cause in you, or in my perception of you. Or I can say, no, the cause is in the environment. This person would never be late on purpose. They must have had a flat, they must have been stuck in flood water, must have had a family emergency, all kinds of things could have come up, but I'll put the cause in the environment rather than in you. And sometimes the cause is in me. We project, so I've read that, a lot of what we project in other people is stuff that's actually characteristic of ourselves too. And when these causes, when we're assigning these causes, and we do this systematically, the cause has an impact on us. It'll impact our behavior, it will impact our feelings, and we'll discount one cause if there are other plausible causes. Okay? If someone's late meeting you for dinner, okay, you know that person well enough. The first 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I've got one friend who's often 30 minutes late. Fortunately, we go to dinner in a group, so if she's really late, it won't matter. She can show up and have her entree while we have dessert. But the point is, depending on how you know that person and what your evaluation of that individual is, will affect how you assign causes. And you'll say, oh, she's always late. He's always late. Things are normal. Don't worry about it. Somebody else, if they're even 5 minutes late, will become concerned and will start going through those possible causes and systematically assigning those and discounting one and saying, maybe they're dead, smashed by a semi. Oh, probably not. Maybe they had a flat tire. Well, probably not, because I think the tires on their car are fairly new and they were coming on the freeway. Well, maybe they had to work late. Okay, that sounds good. Probably had to work late. And whether it's 2 or 3 possible causes or 15 or 20, we'll work through those according to whatever is appropriate to the situation and whatever we see as characteristic. Okay, we're going to turn our attention next to families and just look at some of the characteristics of families, because this makes a good reference point for systems theory, which we talked about earlier, for recognizing how some of these strategies come into play, because the family is such, for most of us at least, is a strong interpersonal context where there's a lot of interaction that goes on, a lot of compliance gaining strategies, lots of rules, and just interpersonal communication. Okay, Fleck has told us that there are several functions that families ought to provide, but the healthy, normal families provide. One is mediation within the family, between the family and society. That parents some families actually have little council meetings or family counseling time where they sit down and work out problems at home. Certainly the parents end up being mediators between claims that the children have, whether it's a claim on the bathroom, a claim on the car. There are all kinds of things that have to be mediated. But sometimes it's between the family and the society. The school calls and says, we want to see a parent up here to discuss your child's behavior or your child's grades or whatever the case may be. So the mediating function is an important one, and it involves a lot of communication. Okay, there are marital functions, obviously, but the partners seek gratification emotionally, physically from one another. They have to share leadership tasks, and all of those involve a lot of communication if this is a healthy, functioning family. There are other functions of family. The nurturing or nurturant, either way you want to say it, functions. But the nurturing functions include, of course, the basic care of the children, security, socialization, sensory stimulation. Lots more when they're little, but even as teenagers, while teens probably don't want to admit it, there's a nurturing, a caring that needs to go on there as well. And even as adults, it may take different communication forms, but nevertheless, it's nice when family members recognize and acknowledge that they love one another, that they care about one another. And all of these are communication functions. Okay, relational functions. The members have to constantly adapt to each other and to extra familial, outside the family, peer groups. Even in elementary school, there's pressure on children, maybe in kindergarten, I'm not sure how much, but, there are pressures to dress certain ways or go to social events or participate in particular things. And all those relationships need to be sustained and maintained and monitored and balanced and so forth. And this is one of the functions of the family, to help set those parameters for the other family members. Whether it's indicating to a parent that they're being gone too much and not showing up for enough school functions or family outings, or usually it's parameters that are being set on the children, particularly the teens. I like the motto of a school that I was familiar with years ago that said, we give our children roots and wings. And that's a logical, appropriate description of what a family ought to do. There should be those nurturing roots that hold on, but there should also be the wings that give them the freedom to go on. And just families are very important. Whether it's the communication function, establishing competent messages, the linguistic customs of the surrounding community and so forth, all of these are important dimensions. And then the emancipation function, which is in effect giving them wings so that they grow from being a tiny child crawling around on the floor to an adolescent who can be responsible for themselves, to an adult that is eventually out on their own. Okay, and then finally the family should serve recuperative functions. It should be a place where family members can come to relax, to regress, to recuperate. Okay, it's where most of us can be our worst selves. Okay, you're on your public behavior in many places. You have to be socially responsible and so forth. And this is a place that the family is a place that we can go back to kick off our shoes, prop up our feet, tell it like it is, to be our own selves. Okay, everybody needs what Carl Rogers has called unconditional positive regard. Let's go back. Okay, we need threat-free environments. And Carl Rogers called this a client-centered approach. There's a whole counseling philosophy to this. But the part that we want to pick up primarily for our purposes is to recognize that in healthy interpersonal relationships, if we can have this threat-free environment, if we can have unconditional positive regard for the people around us, then that's going to be a much more positive thing. It will be more conducive to healthy communication. We'll see this theme picked up a little bit more probably in the next lecture when we get to transactional analysis and look at some of the basic life positions that people have. But unconditional positive regard, an important concept and one that's really fundamental to our interpersonal communication. Okay, Lang has given us the notion of perspective, meta-perspective, meta-meta-perspective, and that's as far as it goes. But not, we individually we perceive things directly. I perceive you, you perceive me. That's a direct perspective. But then there are some times that we perceive things indirectly. Remember when we talked about semantic space and Charles Osgood, semantic space, and how we assign meaning for some things, that we learn things indirectly and assign meaning for those. Well, that's a meta perspective. Maybe. It's not always in that case, but it's an indirectly acquired set of information. Well, often we express an indirect opinion of something. You know, I may say, I like you, I think you like him. Okay, well, when you put that I think on there, it becomes a meta perspective. Because I don't know for sure, I just think that you like him. And I think that he likes you. But I could be wrong. But that's my meta perspective on it. Now, somebody else may come along and say, meta perspective, I think Dr. Hahn thinks that you like him. Or I think she thinks you like her. And, of course, this could go on forever. It's kind of like when you get in one of those situations, sometimes in an elevator, where they've got mirrors on 3 sides. And you see yourself looking at yourself, 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 and it just goes on and on and on to infinity. There was some dippy song, in my opinion, years ago that had a line in it about, I was looking back to see if you were looking back to see if I was looking back to see if you were looking back at me. Well, by the time you go through that many levels, you've kind of lost track of where you are. I was looking back to see if you were looking back to see if I was looking back to see if you were looking back at me. Okay, don't know where we are in that picture. So, for discussion purposes, we stop at the meta level. And we say direct perspective, I like chocolate cake, I hate onions, raw onions. Meta perspective, I think you like raw onions, I think you don't like, I think you are allergic to strawberries. Okay, that's my meta perspective. Meta says, I think you think I like something or whatever. See how it works? Anyway, we won't beat that to death. But it's important to recognize, and this takes us back to what the semanticists told us about the self-reflexiveness of language, our ability to report on the reporter's report of the fire. You know, we abstract on the abstractions of other people. And so we have translations of Aristotle all the way up to the present. Am I abstracting that for you? Or Wendell Johnson abstracting Korzybski and Hahn abstracting Wendell Johnson and you abstracting Hahn and giving those notes to somebody else. And all of those are meta kinds of events. And it's one of the things that's unique, as far as we know, about human communication. Now, maybe dolphins can do that. I don't speak dolphin, so I don't know. You know, but I'm pretty sure my cats and dogs don't do that. You know, they mostly engage in signal behavior. But we won't go back through that. We've been there already. Okay? The next theory that we're going to look at is actually some little communication laws or principles that were set down by 3 of the early researchers, Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson. We often refer to them just as W, B, and J, which is easier to say than Watzlawick 3 times in a row. But they wrote one of the early books that started to do more than talk about how to make a speech in public. You know, for many years we were departments of speech because much of what we did was train people how to give speeches. And then the whole horizon broadened to the field of communication. And that was helped along by this work of Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, who in, I think it was 1957, published a book called The Pragmatics of Human Communication. And I don't know the whole history of how they got to where they were, but this book has some real interesting premises on the front end. You know, this is, nearly 50 years ago now, that they began to observe things like one cannot not communicate. That's not an error, the way it's stated. One cannot not communicate. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about nonverbal communication. Remember we said that even if you say, you know, I'm not talking, and you fold your arms and have an expression on your face, that your body language is giving off some kind of a message. Even if you stretch out on the sofa and go to sleep and you're certainly not receiving any messages, you're still sending messages, which if somebody comes along and perceives that, then can establish meaning. You know, look at this poor tired person taking a nap, or they may go, gee, there's person X taking their ritualistic afternoon nap. That's normal. But anyway, the point is, we really cannot not communicate, even when we're not speaking words out loud, when we're not intentionally giving off those messages, we're potentially giving off messages. When we talked about nonverbal, we talked about artifacts, how brand labels, the car that you drive, the size of your house, the clothes that you wear, the jewelry that you wear, just all kinds of things may contribute to communication if somebody else assigns meaning to those. And so it's impossible for you to not communicate, even if you think you're all clammed up and not going to communicate. Okay, their second premise is that every communication has a content and a relation aspect, and the latter affects the former. In other words, in a message, it makes a difference how I say that message to you. If I say, would you please close the door? You know, that's a courteous, respectful way of doing it. Maybe I'm kind of busy and distracted and there's noise out there, and so I just say, close the door. You know, well, that's kind of, would you do me a favor and close the door, please? I'm too busy to do it. Maybe the door is supposed to be closed and you left it open, and so as you come through, I look at you and say, close the door. You know, here's your friendly little reminder, because you weren't supposed to leave it open, but I don't say that. I just say, close the door. You know, or I look at you and say, close the door. You know, well, that assumes I've got some kind of power over you, that if I say frog, you'd better jump. You know, we could go on with that, and if this were acting 101, they could probably give us 30 different ways, maybe more, to say, close the door, to get across different emotions and feelings. Well, when we listen to that, whether it's, would you close the door, or close the door, we're communicating the relationship as well as the content. And that's what the point of this is. That the way we say something, whether we say it nicely, and therefore it's a respectful kind of communication, or whether we say it harshly, firmly, forcefully, if it's the latter, then this is implying, sometimes the person's wrong, but it's implying that this person has some authority over the other person to be telling them non-verbally, vocally, what to do. You know, if I tell you close the door, you know, you sometimes have kids who talk to children who talk to each other that way. You don't want to say, get out of the front of the TV. I don't have to. You know, well, the relationship part of the message didn't get through there. You know, one bossed the other and it didn't do any good because they had no authority in that relationship. Okay, let's see what else they have to say. The communication interaction sequences are punctuated or grouped. For example, if we come in on a scene, he and she are in the breakfast area, and we'll reverse the roles here. She's hidden behind the newspaper with a cup of coffee, and he's over at the sink getting ready to fix food for, or pull out the food for lunch or whatever. If we come into a situation where he is saying, well, what do you want to eat? Why don't you answer me? I ask you a question. Why don't you answer me? Is he nagging her, who is hidden behind the newspaper, or has that person, you know, is this one withdrawn and the other one nagging, or did the withdrawal occur because the first person was nagging? Maybe person one started out with, you know, I need to know what you want to do about this. I need to know about what you want to do about that. What do you want from the grocery store? What do you want for supper? What do you want for lunch? And this poor person number two is just trying to read, you know, the front page of the newspaper before they go to work or whatever. And so they withdraw. Well, the important point of this premise is you need the whole picture. Just as if you went into, you walk by a movie that's playing on the DVD and you just see a scene and something's happening, you don't know who started it. You know, which one's the good guy, which one, unless, you know, the actors are immediately recognizable and the one is always the hero or heroine. But these are unknown people, some B-plus movie, and you don't get it. You don't have enough information in that situation to size things up. And so these interaction sequences have to be taken in context, and you have to know which came first, nag, withdraw, or withdraw, nag. If the one person is withdrawn and quiet, you know, then nagging may be necessary in the mind of the other individual in order to get the information out of them, so they're not grumpy at supper and expect you to have engaged in mind reading, which we are coming to before too long. You know, so anyway, the point is, just as there are scenes in movies, there are interaction sequences between people when they engage in interpersonal communication, and you need to know where the punctuation is. I've never studied Greek, but I've talked to people who have, and I've looked at Greek and had me observe with them. There's no punctuation. They don't have periods and question marks and colons and semicolons and all quotation marks, these kinds of things. You know, it just goes along there. So how do you know where the sequence starts and ends? Well, in the case of Greek, that's somebody else's problem to figure that out. But in our interpersonal communication, we need to recognize that, you know, communicate way back, square one, lecture one, we said that communication involves senders and receivers of verbal and nonverbal messages who encode and decode those messages, provide feedback to offset, hopefully, noise in any given context that occurs within an environment, and so on. Well, within all of that, with that as a given, we need to know what is the sequence. Who started it? Where did it stop? In order to have a reasonable assessment of that, and if it's important to us to analyze it. You know, mom comes in on two kids fighting. Who started it? Of course, they'll each say the other did. But if someone was listening, then, and we'll come to stages of hassling eventually, too, and how nagging on each other can eventually result in a physiological outburst. But see, if somebody were listening to that and heard it from the beginning, then they would have information that would be insightful to somebody like mom or the school teacher who's doing the analyzing and trying to decide what the consequences are going to be. Because who started it is sometimes important. Usually when mom can't determine who started it, then something is said like, I don't care who started it, you're both going to your rooms if it doesn't stop immediately. Okay, different compliance gaining strategy. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Okay, another axiom is that people, this is a fancy way of saying people communicate verbally and non-verbally, but this is the way WB and J put it. That human beings communicate with each other both digitally and analogically. That is, the words are arbitrary, and the nonverbal signs have intrinsic meaning to them. We won't bog down there. But the point is, this verbal, nonverbal exchange is going on all the time. Okay? And then finally, relational communication will be either symmetrical or complementary. And you've heard the expression opposites attract. Well, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they repel each other. But anyway, we do know from studying relationships, and Dr. Williamson will get into this more when we talk about relational typologies. But there are some couples, whether they're married or not, maybe it's just good friends, who are very symmetrical. They're very similar to one another. Okay, they have the differences are minimized, the similarities are maximized. Okay, the opposite of that is a complementary relationship, and that's one of those things where we say, wow, look at them, opposites attract. Okay? Well, the similarities are minimized and the differences are maximized. And either one of those may take place. It's a concept. It's two concepts: symmetrical relationships, complementary relationships, that help us put a label on what particular pattern we have in any given situation. Okay, we're going to turn now to the same Mark Knapp that we had earlier, who was telling us how relationships develop. He's also going to give us some categories of patterns of destructive communication patterns. So if you want to make things better in your life, avoid some of the stuff we're going to be talking about next. If you find yourself in it, then you may need to assess why it's going on and what you can do to fix. Let's go back. Okay, aggressive communication. There's some people that are just loud and hostile, and we've got our little character here, but they're the fist-banging, aggressive people. They are harsh, they're blunt, they're often loud, they may be interruptive. We'll see some more behaviors in a minute. And there's a difference between aggression and assertiveness. I think most scholars will agree, most people will agree, whether you're very scholarly or not, that assertiveness is a good thing. We want people to have the self-confidence to speak up and express themselves, but there are nice ways to express yourselves, and then there are ugly, hostile, aggressive ways, and I at least would go on record as saying the aggressive behavior is not a pleasant, not a desirable one. Let's move that behavior back a notch or two and see if we can't get you in the assertive phase. But right now what we're going to do is focus for a while on the behaviors that are aggressive, that are unpleasant, and contribute to dysfunctional relationships. Okay, there are 5 stages in what's called stages of hassling, when one person's bugging the other. And kids will say, they won't leave me alone, he's hassling me, da-da-da-da, and sometimes they get in fist fights. Sometimes adults do that. They pull out a gun and shoot each other. Well, that's clear down at level 5 at the physiological outburst level, and it might help to work backwards from that. Physiological outburst is the point where I burst into tears, or someone else I know, we won't name people to protect the guilty, someone else I know screams. And I've been known to scream a few times in my life, children or whatever. Okay. But physiological outbursts may involve screaming, ranting, raving, crying, an emotional breakdown, but usually it doesn't go that far. May involve pulling out a gun and shooting someone. May involve doubling up your fist and socking the other person. Anything that is literally a physiological outburst. Well, how do people get to that level? And if you ask them, why did you slap her or him? Why did you shoot him? Well, they provoked me. Why do children hit each other? Well, they were provoked. Maybe they don't know that word, but they'll say something like, well, he made me do it. It was her fault. She shouldn't have done such and such. She pulled my hair, maybe. Whatever. Varies. Okay. Well, how did they get provoked? Well, often the stage right before provocation is name calling. And right before name calling, there's a cliche phase, and it may even start with what's called repartee. You start with some little cutesy, sarcastic remarks to each other. My brother and I get along really well now that we're adults. But he's 5 years younger, and so about the time he was 10 and I was 15, and we knew better than to hit each other, or Mom would have gotten us both. But he might come along and say, hello, Four Eyes. Well, that's an insult. And I might say, hello, Double Ugly. Well, by today's standards, those are really mild name-calling things, but, what you could call each other years ago is different from what you call each other now. There's some things that if we had said back then, we would have just had our tongues removed, and then there wouldn't be any choice. But anyway, some sort of cutesy wordplay back and forth, and often repartee is okay. If it stops there, you've just had this little one-up, one-down kind of exchange with one another, and everything is okay. But then sometimes it moves into cliche, you know, and it often involves some foul language as well, particularly as children insult each other and call each other's mothers' names, and we won't put those things out on the network, you know. But you can imagine scenarios that you've seen that started out with some little sarcastic remarks and then moved into something like, well, that's stupid. Are you calling me stupid? Yeah, I'm calling you stupid. Well, I'm calling you such and such. And so they do that, and then it just works its way on up until it gets really ugly. And then at some point, somebody says something that's over the line. That trigger word has been hit. The emotional button has been pushed, whatever the case may be, and then you're into physiological outburst. So if you can work, you know, if you are in or you observe situations where these things happen, you know, this is predictable. It will vary from one interpersonal situation to another, but if you monitor and observe, then you can observe with these children, with these teenagers, with these two adults, you know, here they go again. They're getting set up for this. And it's only a matter of minutes until they're going to be over that line and they'll be throwing things or hitting each other or whatever the case may be. And it's especially important if you can monitor that about yourself, because then you have the obligation. Remember how we talked earlier about getting out of situations. You have the choice to withdraw. You have the choice to get out of the situation before it escalates to a point that it really becomes unpleasant. So those are your 5 stages of hassling. Okay, there's some other destructive patterns that we want to take a look at. Not nearly as bad as the aggressive behavior is the evasive behavior. Let's get these up here and then we'll talk, and then we'll talk about them. Sometimes what we're doing is just avoiding the topic. Now, occasionally it's a good thing to avoid or evade. You need to do that until the other person cools down. Or I remember I had a student one time, he had his own little band and they were having a problem. I think it was with the drummer, but I'm not sure. It doesn't matter. The fellow kept showing up drunk. You know, and I think it was the drummer, because it's really hard to keep your synchronization and your timing and all that stuff going, you know, if you're inebriated. And so they needed to talk with him about that and try to work out a plan. Well, it wouldn't do any good to talk to him while he was drunk. So to avoid in that situation, to evade, was a good choice. But if this becomes a regular pattern between two people, the boss, the employee, a married couple, a dating couple, you know, any people that have regular relationships with one another, then there's likely to be a long-range dysfunctional problem that's developing here. So anyway, sometimes what we do is change the focus of responsibility. You know, we say, how did this mess get all over the floor? Well, it's not my fault, it's his fault. That's real good with the kids, you know. Well, did you spill, you know, you were the one drinking chocolate milk and now it's all over the floor. Is this not your chocolate milk that's on the floor? How did it get here? Well, it's not my fault. You see, he knocked it over, or she made me knock it over, or whatever. And so there's a shift of responsibility. It's not my problem, and you can apply that in your life. Okay, sometimes we change the direction of the conversation. Maybe mom's waiting for kids to get home from school who were supposed to have cleaned their room over the weekend and didn't, and, you know, there's a big rush that morning. And the kids come in and say, "What's for supper?" And the response is, "You need to go clean your room like you were supposed to do." Okay? Simply a change in the direction of the conversation. Maybe it's adults who are talking to each other. You know, and the focus just shifts. Somebody asks you a question about work or whatever the case may be. You change the direction of the conversation, and that's an evasive move. Okay? Sometimes we change the level of the conversation. Maybe I've got a trashy, I don't, but if I had a really junked up front yard, or, the trash was sitting out there or something for too long, and my neighbor came over, she'll sometimes suggest that I trim my hedges, but, maybe she comes over and says, what are you going to do about all this trash out front? The junk's kind of collecting along this side of the yard. And instead of answering with what I'm going to do, I may say something, well, it's really not my responsibility. Or it's my responsibility, but it shouldn't be. The Civic Club ought to take care of this sort of thing. Or the City of Houston ought to take care of this thing, because people have to work as much as I do, yak, yak, blah, blah, can't be responsible for this, that, and the other. And so somebody else ought to be taking care of this. Okay? Whether it's picking up trash in the hallway or doing things in a timely manner. Anyway, when we change the level, and usually we're moving from a specific conversation that involves us to a higher level that puts the responsibility, it's kind of hard to put the responsibility on people below you, although there's probably a scenario somewhere where that works. So, but to claim, it's the county's responsibility, it's the state's responsibility, it's the university's responsibility to keep the hallways clean. I shouldn't have to bend over and pick up paper out of the halls. I go down the hall. Not my responsibility. Okay? Even though I could do it and the place would look better, and if everybody picked up 3 pieces of litter a day around here, we'd be hundreds of thousands of pieces of litter less before the day was over. Okay, inconsistent messages, and we'll come to those with double bind theory shortly. But sometimes we say one thing one day, something else another day. Sometimes within the matter of minutes, you catch people in inconsistent messages, and that's a frustrating kind of thing to be engaged in as well. Okay, other disconfirming patterns that occur are things like ignoring the other person. Don't you just hate it when you're talking to somebody and they ignore you? Or you're in a group and somebody walks up, or you're the one who walks up and go, hey guys, what's going on? And nobody answers you. Okay, that's very disconfirming, and ultimately it's a destructive kind of pattern if it keeps happening over time. Now, you need to be careful. Maybe you've walked up and they're really engaged in a conversation and you're interrupting them, which then is it's from a different perspective, but that too is a disruptive, destructive, disconfirming pattern, because it behooves you to pay attention, and if you walk up on somebody, not to interrupt them. In this culture, at least, we consider that a very rude behavior. Unless, there's a fire, there's something really, there has to be a socially acceptable reason for you to just go up and interrupt people. But you probably know people who do that, who, when they arrive, they think their presence justifies their dominating the scene. It's like, I'm here now, so all the conversation should turn to me. And I'll set the agenda for what we talk about, and because anything that you were talking about must be less important than what I have to say. Do you like that attitude? I don't like that attitude. And so that's a negative, disconfirming kind of thing. So sometimes we have impervious responses, irrelevant responses. We don't respond to what the person is actually addressing, and that's destructive and unhealthy. Sometimes it's tangential, it's just not relevant. Okay, mind reading we kind of alluded to earlier. Anytime you expect somebody else to read your mind, you're setting yourself up for trouble. Well, I thought you knew. How many times have you missed a connection with someone, missed an appointment or a rendezvous, or, I thought you knew I'd be there at 2:30, or I thought you knew that I'd pick you up at that corner instead of this corner because today I'm going to turn left instead of right when we leave, whatever. Anything that calls on, now if the other person can read your mind, and the better you know someone, the more fun that is. There are some people who at a party can just look at each other, maybe you've been there for several hours, you're ready to go home, you look at the other person, and then that little micro momentary cue, you say, your eyes say, I'm ready to get out of here and go home. How about you? And all it takes is a split second, and the two looks you exchange confirm all of that. Well, that's a confirming strategy, and we'll come to those in a minute. And that's lovely when that happens. Okay, it saves lots of words and time and so forth. But when you expect that, that's not good, and it's likely to lead to trouble. Okay, hypercritical. You want somebody nagging on you all the time? Pick, 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 pick. Nag, dang, 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 nag. Gripe, 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 gripe. Whine, whine, whine. You know, the hypercritical person is setting up a destructive pattern. Now, usually best friends give each other permission to gripe, for a certain period of time, up to a certain point, and then they're done. But generally, we don't want to listen to other people poor mouth, bad mouth, gripe. And we certainly don't like it when they're critical of us, when they're hypercritical about us. Okay, collusion is another destructive pattern. This is when two people are in cahoots with each other, as it were. They don't like the relationship, but for whatever their reasons, they don't want to get out of it. A good example would be a boss and an employee who act like they like each other, but the employee really hates the job, would take another in a heartbeat if they could get one, but they can't, and they need the paycheck, so they stay there. Okay? And they act like they like that. I mean, I guess it's better to act like you like your boss if you're stuck there than to admit you don't like the boss, but it's not a good pattern. It's an unhealthy relationship to be in. And maybe the boss can't stand the employee either. Or maybe it's a different scenario and the employee does like the boss, but the boss can't stand the employee. But particularly the prime example of collusion is when both of them are involved in this. And so they're pretending to have positive feelings and emotions that they really don't have. Okay? And that's an unhealthy kind of relationship. Okay, another thing that we get ourselves into is called a false, untenable position. Okay, and if we look up here, our little doggy with his costume on, he's in a false position. He's not as he should be. Well, when people get themselves into jobs that are inappropriate, that maybe they take a sales job that involves drinking and partying, and that's inconsistent with the rest of their lifestyle, and so that's unhealthy. It's just not them. Anytime we get ourselves in a situation that's really not us, then the better label for that is a false, untenable position. And that's ultimately going to be destructive because we'll be miserable, and usually leakage of communication will cause problems with other people as well. Very few people can fake it for very long without some sort of leakage of information that causes a problem. Okay, attributions and injunctions. Let's define those. An attribution tells you how to be. An injunction tells you what to do. An attribution tells you how to be. An injunction tells you what to do. You've heard of court injunctions. You get a court order to stop something, usually. Occasionally there could be a court order to go back to work. But an injunction tells you what you're going to do. And if the judge tells you, you better do it. Okay? We get lots of attributions and injunctions from our parents. I want you to be a good little girl. I want you to be nice at school today. Now be polite when you meet Mrs. So-and-so. Be kind. And I think, Teacher Supply, you can buy little bumblebee stickers that tell you, be kind, be honest, be trustworthy, but and that's good. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be those things, but we have to be careful about who has the authority to tell us how to be. Okay? It goes back to those compliance gaining strategies. If this is someone that we value who's telling us how to be, and we have a strong relationship with those folks, then that's a different matter. But generally, we don't want our friends telling us what to do. Well, I think you ought to do this. Well, I think you did that. Well, I think you should do such and such. Well, you better be careful. You better be going in early. You better be staying late. You better be, whatever the case may be. Well, those are, maybe, interesting play on words. Okay, but the attributions tell us how we should be. The injunctions tell us what to do. Now, you put on your galoshes before you go out in the rain. Don't you forget your umbrella. Now, don't you tell those jokes at Grandma's house. Don't you get another piece of cake. Don't you put ice cream on top of that cake. You go in there and study before. You go out there and mow the yard before. How we should be and what we should do are generally, not that we can never say that to someone, but when there's that kind of pattern that's developed, then that may very well be an unhealthy, destructive pattern that's developed between the two people. Okay, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when the false perceptions become reality. And we've heard of people believing they're failures and turning into failures because they've been programmed that way. The flip side of that, though, is that if you can have a positive self-fulfilling prophecy, then that can be good. But particularly when there are false things about the individual. Okay, we get into a paradox. If you're looking up, as we're at this part of the lecture, you see on the screen the sign that says, "Don't read this sign." Well, by the time you've read the sign, it's too late not to read the sign. And so that's another destructive pattern because it creates a self-contradictory communication. And we get into this kind of relationship with other people in what Gregory Bateson calls a special relational paradox or double bind theory. You have two people. One's the victim, the shark, the poor little fish, the poor little person. There's some kind of an assertion, and then there's a contradictory assertion. And what's happening is that you get the person set up so that there's no correct response. No matter what you do, any behavioral response is going to set you up for punishment. Okay? And so the victim sees no escape in this particular situation. It's either the frying pan or the fire. A catch-22. We've got different labels for that. An example might be a situation where the child goes off to school and the parents have given that injunction now, or attribute, you be good when you go to school today. Injunction, no fighting. Don't hit anybody. Or, well, they might say, maybe one parent says that. Got to fix my example here a little. One parent says, now you be good. You don't hit anybody. No more fights at school. The other parent, though, walks the child out to the school bus and says, I know your mom or your dad, whichever, said, don't you hit anybody, but I'm telling you, son, if somebody punches you, you punch them back. I don't want any child of mine standing there letting somebody else beat up on them. You stand up for yourself. You defend yourself. You have the right to do that. Okay? Or maybe it's the parents who both say, you defend yourself, you stand up for yourself. We don't raise any sissies in this family. Somebody socks you, you sock them back. They kick you in the shin, you kick them back. Tit for tat. But then it's the teacher who is the other half, who has the flip side of that. And it's the teacher who says, there will be no fighting in my classroom. Even if somebody hits you, I don't want you to hit them back. I want you to come to me and tell me. Well, that creates that double bind if the child likes the teacher and loves their parents. Now, if the child can't stand the teacher, then that takes us back to consistency theory, doesn't it? There's an attitude object and two people, and they do or don't like each other, and the situation is either balanced or not balanced, and so forth. Well, we won't go all the way back there, but just so you recall that there is a link there. Okay, but you get those contradictory messages between people that are valued to you, and that creates this double bind. And it's particularly difficult for children. And what Bateson discovered, he's a psychiatrist, he discovered that when significant others create this kind of situation, they create this no-win situation for another person, yeah, more often it's for a child because they don't know how to bail out of that particular, or not bail out, but get themselves out of the situation, then schizophrenia may result. And there's a correlation, not that all schizophrenia is caused by this, but apparently there is a correlation there that these contradictory messages contribute to that condition. Now, as adults, we're more responsible generally. We, again, depending on your cognitive complexity, depending on your communication repertoire, depending on, go back to Green, you know, what do you have in your memory for retrieval and utilization and so on. That affects the number of responses that you have in a particular situation. And the more mature child might say, and it depends on the parents too, regardless of how mature the child is. If the parents are going to smack you, you know, that's a different deal. But the more mature child would probably say, well, I really don't know what to do because the teacher has told our class that if we hit anybody, even if they have hit us first, we're going to suspension or we're going to the principal's office. You know, we're going to be in some kind of detention. We're going to get a bad conduct grade on our report card. And being able to describe that also involves a certain element of assertive behavior on the part of the individual. But that assertiveness and that ability to create a logical message design, to use a communication plan, to retrieve out of your repertoire of possible responses, all of those things go together in enabling you to salvage that particular situation and work through it so that you're not permanently caught in that type of double bind. Okay? It doesn't just happen with children. It sometimes happens with adults who have to respond to more than one supervisor. You know, it's not the problem around here, but if my chairman, if my director of the school were telling me one thing and the dean of the college was telling me something else, you know, that would be one of these double bind situations. So you may find that kind of event taking place in the workplace. Okay, well, kind of in summary for today then, we have looked at a number of relationship strategies. Those were developed by Leslie Baxter, and you've got the list in your workbook. Again, let me remind you that all of these PowerPoint presentations are on WebCT, those of you that are watching this over the tape purchase approach. You can download the visual part of this and have that as a reinforcement to your book. But anyway, we've looked at relationship disengagement strategies. We've looked at compliance gaining strategies, how you get people to do what you want them to do. We've looked at the attribution theory of Hyder and Kelly. And we've looked at functions of families. We looked at Lang and the meta perspective and the meta-meta perspective and gotten a little contrast there. We went through the communication axioms of Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, and especially looked at the destructive communication patterns that Mark Knapp identified for us, finishing with the double bind theory of Gregory Bateson. In our next lecture, we'll start with social penetration theory, which is similar to Knapp's stages of coming together. We'll look again at social exchange theory, and we'll get into some of those tests for how to check the quality of a relationship. If you think your relationship might be falling apart, you could be right. And we've got some relationship tests that you can use to check out that relationship and find out what kind of a condition that it's actually in. Thanks.